All right, I hope everybody can hear me okay. Good. All right, well, I want to do two things today in the time we've got. And the first is I want to kind of give you some broad context about energy issues, because much of the debate we have in this country about energy policy is occurring without reference to facts. And so it's important to first look at some of the facts. And then I want to take some of those facts and talk about some of the claims that have been made about green energy in particular. All right, so I first want to give you a flavor. I probably don't need to, but I want to give you a flavor of some of the religious debates on this. And this is a quote from the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew I of Constantinople. I'm an Orthodox Christian, so I thought I'd pick on my own church rather than somebody else's. And this is his recent statement of his about energy. He says, "Our Creator granted us the gifts of sun, wind, water, and ocean, all of which may safely and sufficiently provide energy. Ecologically friendly science and technology has discovered ways and means of producing sustainable forms of energy for our ecosystem. Therefore, we ask, why do we persist in adopting such dangerous sources of energy?" By which he means oil and coal and nuclear and natural gas and things like that. Now, since I co-wrote this book called The False Promise of Green Energy, you probably already know that the ecumenical patriarch and I don't see eye to eye on this. And I think he's asking the wrong questions here. And I'll just tell you a brief anecdote that I think really illustrates a difference in approach. So he wants to be known as the Green Patriarch. He's embraced this label. Long time ago, I was a lawyer in rural West Texas, and I was driving across West Texas, and I got I could only get one radio station, and it was a radio preacher, and he was telling a story about faith healing. It was really an interesting story, and he said, you know, I have this colleague, and he and I were talking, and he was telling me how one day, as he was preparing to give a very big sermon, he had a terrible headache. And he and his wife got down on their knees and prayed to God to lift this headache from him so that he could deliver this important sermon. And I said to him, "You arrogant person, God gave you aspirin. Why do you need a personal miracle to do this? God gave us energy, and he gave it to us to use. He didn't give it to us to admire in the ground. Right? He gives a lot of things to admire, but I think that he gave us resources to put to use. And that's the framework from which I'm coming from. I don't think we need to ask for a miracle that solar power becomes economically feasible. I hope someday it does, but for now, he's given us resources that are cheap and clean and easy to use." Now the second point, this is a quote from Richard Darman. And I promise I won't show you too many wordy quotes. But Richard Darman, who was director of OMB under the first President Bush, and Republicans always get beaten up for being anti-environment. And Darman said, "We are all environmentalists. The president is an environmentalist, Republicans and Democrats are environmentalists, Jane Fonda and the National Association of Manufacturers, Magic Johnson, Danny DeVito, Candace Bergen, the Golden Girls, Bugs Bunny, and the cast of Cheers are all environmentalists." And what he meant by that, there's some truth to this. What he meant is there is broad agreement in American society, indeed in the world, that the environment is a good thing. We all live in it. We like beautiful things. We don't like pollution. There's no pro-pollution party. There's no one out there advocating destruction of the environment. Right? It's not the guy with the thin mustache and the black hat villain type thing. Right? So our debates are about trade-offs. Our debates about whether or not we want to do a little more of this or a little more of that. We are debating very fine points in terms of how to clean up the environment. What's better? There are no easy answers to any of these questions. Wind power chops up birds, and it spoils the landscape, as Ted Kennedy would have told you since he fought vigorously to prevent wind power within sight of his home. Right? Wind power makes a noise that drives neighbors crazy, as the people who have passed zoning ordinances to zone out wind farms in their neighborhoods will tell you. So there are trade-offs, right? Wind power is not obviously a pure environmentally good thing. Now, natural gas has trade-offs, right? All these things have trade-offs. So we're talking about which of the harms that will happen are the smallest harms and which of the benefits are the largest benefits. We're not debating between the evil guy who wants to destroy the environment and that. So these protesters who get out there and they're demanding green jobs and no coal and climate justice and so forth have a very narrow, one-sided view of the issues. And what we need to respond to that with is context and and look at the facts and look at the trade-offs that we're making and debate those trade-offs. So let me give you an illustration of those trade-offs. I'm an economist. I love graphs. All right. So those of you having sort of flashbacks to college and looking for the exit, we've locked the doors from the outside. This is a graph of emission standards for volatile organic compounds from vehicles, from cars and trucks, right? And so this is 1965 when the first standards were put in, and this is 2010. You'll see that this line is essentially approaching zero. And that you could draw this same graph for every one of the major pollutants that EPA regulates. In every case, we cannot make the internal combustion engine any cleaner. We are asymptotically approaching zero, for those of you who want to use big words, right? You can't make a car cleaner except by making it higher mileage, right? And there are trade-offs in making cars higher mileage. They have to be lighter, which means they're not as safe, which means that our children riding in the back seat are more likely to be squashed by a truck, things like that. So we have to make these trade-offs. We have made cars and trucks about as clean as they can get. And that is, we are now debating very tiny improvements when we fiddle with it. In 1965, we were talking about pretty big improvements. We already did all those. We did all the cheap ones. Actually, if we wanted to clean the air up, the best thing we could do would be to buy up old cars in Mexico and subsidize their purchase of new ones. Because our old cars end up in developing countries where people value transportation and are willing to accept the dirtier cars, just as we were when we weren't as rich. These cars are still running around the third world. And if we sent them some cleaner ones, they'd be happy to drive them as long as we paid for them. But what we do instead is we debate, can we get even closer to zero there? So that's one thing. It's all about trade-offs. The other context that is really, really important that the left never talks about, and I think that we have to talk about and that we don't talk about enough, is my favorite graph. And I see a few people here from last night from the Tea Party group, so they're going to have to look at this graph again, because I show this to everybody. This is the best graph ever. I didn't make it. Another economist did. So we're starting at 1000 BC, going up to now. And this line here is the per capita income of the world's population. All right? And it's set at 1 is the standard of living in 1800. And the point is that from 1000 BC to 1800, it doesn't change much. From 1000 BC, from the earliest dates we have records, to 1800, everybody in the world lived awful lives. They were all poor. You could be a king, you might be a little above the line. You could be a peasant, you're a little below the line. Everybody lived at a very sustainable level because it was just enough food that you replaced the population. Right? So if the population got a little bit bigger, people had to die off or you had to eat less. And eventually when you start eating less, you die off. So we all stayed pretty much there. Around 1800, in Britain and the Netherlands first, and gradually elsewhere, something amazing happened, which we call the Industrial Revolution. And for the developed world, we went up like this, to the point where today we have 16 times the material well-being in the industrialized world that everybody in the world had in 1800, right? That's really amazing. That's a huge number. This little line here is the rest of the world that didn't industrialize. It's sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. And they kind of went down a little bit, but they're still around the 1800 level, right? So a billion people in the world are still living down here. There's a great book, The Bottom Billion, that talks about them. The rest of us went up here. Now, these people would also like to go up here, and it turns out doing stuff like giving them private property rights and stuff helps with that. But that change, right? One of the consequences of that change, one of the things that made this possible was the use of energy. So it's using energy that has given us the lifestyle we have. And I'm not just talking about driving your car. There's energy embedded in everything you have. If you take medicines, energy is embedded in pharmaceuticals. If the clothing you wear, energy is embedded in those things. About half the cost of pharmaceuticals comes from the energy costs of making them. Just as one example. There's a wonderful report from the American Enterprise Institute that we summarize in the book that talks about that. And just to dramatically show that, a couple things. This is the Human Development Index on this axis. You want to be higher. So here's the United States. Up here, we're up high on the Human Development Index. So the better, all sort of measures of well-being, nutrition, lifespan, medical care, things like that, higher that way. This is per capita energy use. right? The green countries, which are the industrialized countries, the US, Canada, Japan, Netherlands, UK, and so forth, we have high human development indices, and we also use a lot of energy. Poor countries have low energy use, and they also have low human development indexes. Now that it's correlation, not causation, but I think that it's not too much of a stretch to say there's a connection between having the availability of energy and having lives that are not horrific, right? I mean, nobody wants to live in Congo. They don't have an illegal immigration problem, right? People aren't going there. So down here, where there's low energy use per capita, there's also low quality of life. So this is just electricity. You could do this for all forms of energy. The point is, right, that as we use energy, people's lives get better. And when we talk about our social mission as a church, we usually talk about trying to improve the lives of people in places like this. And making energy more expensive does not improve their lives. It condemns them to stay in that place. Right? So the goal should be to sort of help these people into that. Just as one example, the largest source of air pollution in the world today. Anybody know what that is? No, not the country. The largest thing that makes pollution. Not coal burning power plants. Manure, burning biomass in homes. That causes indoor air pollution that affects predominantly women and children because they're the ones in the home. The men are smart. They get out and go to work in the fields away from the air pollution. Indoor air pollution is the biggest air pollution problem we face in the world. It affects primarily women and children in developing countries. If you replaced those stoves in their homes, stoves that we're talking about an open fire basically, with a stove, an electric stove, a gas stove, whatever, that would improve air quality, that would improve the quality of life, that would improve the lives of the poor. If we care about the poor, we should want to do that. And we've got some examples in the book of technologies that do that, very inexpensive technologies. Right? We don't have to build a giant power plant and pipe power to their house. We can get them sort of biogas digesters in their villages and produce things, but we can also get them natural gas-fired power plants. We've got lots of natural gas around the world. There's a lot we can do to make these people's lives better. Most of it involves energy. Just to bring it home to here, this is a map of the travel times from New York City in 1860. So each line is a day. So one day, I think we're about on this line. So it's either 2 or 3 days to get from New York City to here in 1860. But Michigan's got 3. I mean, it's hard to get up into upper Michigan in 1860. It takes a long time, right? I got here in a day, less than a day. I was on a plane. I was comfortable. I had food, not too much food, but at least I had some nuts and something to drink, which was much better than riding in a covered wagon across here in 1860, right? It is possible, right? And that has improved our lives. That improves our lives in many ways. We can go visit family, we can visit friends, we can be tourists, we can do all sorts of things because energy has made transportation cheaper. And just the last one, this is the number of hours it takes to get light. Back in 8000 BC, it took sort of almost 100 hours of work to get an hour's worth of light. So that was, you had to really work hard, right, to go gather the wood and things like that. By now, it takes almost no time for you to get light, right? You flick on the switch, and your electric bill, you have to work a few minutes to pay for an hour's worth of light today. So we've made possible for people to have light. Well, what does that mean? That means you can read at night, right? You can read. Now, hopefully you're reading the Bible, but maybe you're reading, whatever it is you're reading. You can surf the internet. We've improved our lives in so many ways that we take for granted. And most of those ways are tied to energy. All right, so energy is important. That was probably an easy thing to convince you of since you came to this talk. This is a messy graph, but it's a good one. It's from the Energy Information Administration. I urge you to look at their webpage. They have a terrific webpage, especially the kids, for school reports. Who can quarrel with government statistics? All right, so I'm just gonna point out the major features here that even people in the back can see, but we've got an earlier version of this is in the book, and you can get it off their website. All right, here are sources of energy. So petroleum, natural gas, coal, renewables, including hydro, right, which actually environmentalists don't like, large hydro, and we're reducing our hydroelectric capacity in this country, and nuclear. Right, so the size of the block gives you a sense of how much that contributes to total energy. We get about 37% of our energy from petroleum, about 25% from natural gas, 21% from coal, 8% from renewable, and about 9% from nuclear. Over here is what we might do with it. So we have transportation, industrial, residential, commercial, and electric power. So electric power uses up about 40% of our energy. These lines that connect it, and you can see this in the book, and I'll just sort of describe a couple of them. This line here from nuclear power goes to electric power, and as a 100 by that means 100% of our nuclear power goes to generate electricity, which is common sense. We don't have small nuclear power plants. That's what it's going. 21% of our electric power comes from nuclear. So if you turned off all the nuclear plants in the country tomorrow, we'd be missing 20% of our electricity. That's a big chunk. Renewable energy, about 50% goes into electric power. That's hydro for the most part. And then we have about 14% goes into transportation fuels. That's things like ethanol and biodiesel. Only 4%, though, of our transportation fuels are renewables, right? 4%. So you hear a lot about the rapid growth in renewables. Well, you can grow a lot from 4% and still not get anywhere, right? So it's, you give your kid a penny, and when they've saved up a quarter, they've grown a lot, right? They've grown 25 times. They still don't have enough money to buy anything. 94% of our transportation fuels are from petroleum. So we will be using petroleum for a long time for that. And we need to recognize that fact and deal with it, not come up with fantasies about other kinds of energy. And then, just the same way, this is from the International Energy Agency, right? So what's even better than the US government would be an international agency. So this clearly could be in a school report. This is from 1980 to 2020, so projections. This is fossil fuels in the black. And this green bit is non-fossil sources. So all energy use, fossil. You can see virtually all of our energy is fossil fuels, and there's this sort of slowly growing band of non-fossil. All right, so let's break down the non-fossil. Non-fossil turns out to be almost entirely nuclear, hydro, and biomass, i.e. burning wood and things like that, right? So again, we're projecting some growth, and this is the wind and solar. Now break that down, and here's what wind and solar looks like. And we're about here, right? Getting ready for this big takeoff. And so in the future, it's going to grow really fast. It's not growing really fast now, but it's pretty soon. It's going to grow really fast, right? And when it does grow really fast, it gets really big. So if you just look at this one, you say, wow, that's getting really big. That's a tiny piece. That's this little teeny piece of this little teeny piece, right? It's just not going to be making a substantial contribution to world energy needs, right? And if we pin our hopes on this, we are engaged in fantasy. And reality is that the cheap, clean energy sources we have now are natural gas-based. If you add into that coal, nuclear, and petroleum, which each have downsides to them, right? Nothing's perfect. But if you add those in, that's virtually all of our energy needs going forward. So there may be some contribution, and it's quite possible that someone is going to invent some incredible new technology at some point. I have great faith in human ingenuity. I'm also virtually certain that person doesn't work for the federal government, right? Somebody's going to invent something. That's how we got these forms of energy. People invented stuff, and they're going to do it. The last big fact I want to give you concerns just world energy demand. And again, I apologize for those who were here last night because I like this graph so much I show it to everybody. 1900 to 2000, this line is the number of cars per 1,000 people in the United States. And by about now, we're a little more than 800 cars per 1,000 people, right? So in the US today, there are about 800 cars per 1,000 people. All right, so that's sort of a benchmark. The various dots are other places in the world at different times. So, for example, Western Europe in 2005 has about 600 cars per 1,000 people, right? Now and so they're about, we can read down, they're about where the United States was in 1970. Now, the reason Western Europe has fewer cars per person than we do is twofold. One, Europe is smaller, and there's not a lot of parking, right? It's crowded old cities. And so the advantages of a car are lower. They have robust public transportation systems because it's very dense. And so the benefits of not having a car are higher. Using the car is expensive because Europeans tax gasoline at a much higher rate than we do. And so when you see higher gas prices in Europe, it's not because oil costs more there, it's because the governments tax it at a much higher rate. So it's more expensive to operate a car, so fewer people have cars. All right, so Western Europe in 2005 is about 1970 levels for the United States. All right, so that's a range of where they are. They're about 600 cars per thousand. This is China in 2005. They're about where we were in 1915. Right, so China is about where the United States is in 1915. Now, I think China looks a lot more like the United States than it does like Europe. We have pictures of China as very crowded and so forth. That's the coastal cities like Shanghai and places like Beijing. Most of China is big and spread out. So there are vast areas of China where there's not going to be a bullet train. There's going to be a car. And every Chinese person I've met, and I teach in China, and I've met quite a few, wants a car. Now, they're very interested in having better lives, shockingly. It turns out Chinese people are just like American people. They want better lives for themselves and their families. And one element in a better life for most Chinese people is acquiring a car. And they don't want a used American car. They want a new car. They want it to be nice. They want to have air conditioning. They want an MP3 player. They've got iPhones. I mean, it's very sophisticated demand, right? So whatever they do, they are not staying at 1915 levels of cars. That's just not happening, right? China's growing fast. We don't really know how fast. They make up the numbers, but it really is growing fast, right? So let's say they get to Western Europe levels. That's just like Western Europe. Now, I think that's implausible. I think they're much more like us in terms of the physical geography of the country. And so it's much more plausible to think they're going to be more at American levels. But let's just say they go to Western Europe levels. That would be going from 25 cars per 1,000 people to 500 cars per 1,000 people. Right? That's an enormous increase. Now, let's say they all buy hybrids. Also implausible because hybrids are expensive. And if you're going to spend extra money on a car in China right now, you're buying a car that has more features, not that simply costs more. But let's say they all buy hybrids. So that maybe the effective demand for fuel is half of what the 500 level is. They're going to be using a lot of fuel. And we haven't even talked about India yet, or the rest of Asia, which is all growing rapidly, in which there are lots of people who would like to have cars. So the rest of the world is catching up to us, right? Europe's probably not going to get a lot more cars, but Asia is. And so is Latin America and Africa if they get development too. Development brings a desire for personal mobility, which is what a car is. It's something that all human beings want and seek to improve their lives. And so there's going to be much more demand for energy in the future, right? Even if they're driving hybrids, which I don't think they're going to. All right, now I don't think there's anything particularly Christian about suggesting that foreigners forego the benefits that we've enjoyed. I don't think that's a very Christian attitude to say, well, you know, bad luck for you, you developed late, so you don't get to have this stuff. And I don't think we want to do that. If you think about energy demand, these are some numbers from, again, an International Energy Agency report. Over the next 25 years, 90% of the projected growth in global energy demand is outside the OECD, right? The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the developed world, right? So the rest of the world is going to be where the demand for energy is coming. So in some sense, it almost doesn't matter what we do because we can tell the Chinese not to do stuff and they just don't listen. The global passenger car fleet is going to double, reaching almost 1.7 billion cars by 2035, right? Almost all those cars are going to appear somewhere else, right? Even if we all had a car each, we'd only be looking at a sort of 25% increase here. The changes are coming, and they're coming in the rest of the world, and we're going to have to adapt to that. And part of that is to be thinking about energy markets as global markets that we are participating in. All right, now, here's a couple more numbers. This is the cost, and again, it's from a government study looking at the cost, a system levelized cost, so taking all the costs that you spend in building the power plant and so forth to generate electricity from a variety of things, and I've arranged them from cheapest to most expensive. So to generate a megawatt, in 2007, constant dollars, natural gas, about $84, right? That's the cheapest. The most expensive is solar photovoltaic at almost $400. Now that's a big difference, right? So we've got a whole bunch of things in advance. So coal and natural gas, depending on which form you get, and there's even more information in the book about this, but sort of $84 to $104 per megawatt. Nuclear is about 107. Geothermal about 111, and then we start getting a big bump. Wind, 141, offshore wind, 230, solar thermal, that's where you are heating up the water directly, about 264, and solar photovoltaic, about 400. So let's say these get much more efficient. 10%, that would be a significant increase in efficiency, right? They're still a lot more expensive than these other technologies. And these other technologies get more efficient too, right? They don't stand still. So we can get improvements across the board on this. So there's a pretty high cost to this technology, right? We're told that these things are great. Assuming they are great, they're very expensive, right? Now, so I wanted to try to connect that to a religious theme. The parable of talents, I'm sure you all know that one. That's the one free market types like to trot out all the time, right? Where Jesus tells the story of the master who gives the money to the various servants, and the bad servant is the one who buries the money in the ground and does nothing with it. And he brings it back, and the master says, you're an evil and lazy slave. And this servant has said, I was afraid of you. I knew that you were very mean and so forth, and so I just hid it because I was really afraid I'd lose it. And he said, you did that. You should have deposited my money with the bankers. And on my return, I would receive my money back with interest. And then he casts him out into the outer darkness. All right, so that's the bad one. We're doing something worse in energy. We are borrowing from our children to pay for these technologies, right? I'm not paying for it, and I'm not going to pay for it because we borrowed the money to do all this stuff from China. And we'll be paying it back when my children are paying it back. So my children and my grandchildren are funding this. And the question I ask when I debate green energy advocates, and I never get an answer, I can never get them to answer this question, is when do I have to stop paying? Tell me how much longer I have to pay. We have been promised since the Carter administration that in just a few more years, with a few more billion, we will have these marvelous technologies for you, these magic technologies that produce energy out of sunlight and wind, and there are no downsides. There are downsides. There's lots of bad stuff going on with producing these things, very environmentally damaging, but the point is they never stop taking the money, and they're now taking it from my children, and I object to that. It's one thing to rob me, it's another thing to rob my children and my unborn grandchildren. Right? My children aren't even married yet, but there's going to be grandchildren at some point. We're clear on that. We've explained that to them. And when the grandchildren get here, I don't want them having to pay back money for Solyndra, for robots that whistle Disney tunes. Right? Think about this. The Solyndra factory was built in California, the highest cost business environment in the United States. A brand new factory. There are empty factories in Michigan and Illinois and Ohio that they could have bought for pennies on the dollar. Instead, they built a brand new factory in California. And they put in robots that whistle Disney tunes. Now, I don't know what the Disney feature costs. Maybe it was a little bit. I know that no entrepreneur would spend his own money on whistling Disney tunes. How many people have been to Disney? How long did it take you to get It's a Small World out of your head, right? We pay money to avoid Disney tunes. This is not right, right? This is not being a good steward. Right? This is cast often in religious circles in terms of stewardship. That is it being a good steward to take our children's money. And that's what we're doing. We're taking our children's money and giving it to politically connected people. That's what Solyndra was. That's what Fiskar is and so forth. That's what the Chevy Volt is. Right? And economics can help here. Thomas Woods, who wrote a marvelous book called The Church and the Market about sort of market economics in Catholic thought, he said, I'm an economist, I can't talk about theology. And you really were taking a chance inviting a law professor, right, who's normally analogized to the Pharisees in biblical stories, to talk theology. But, we can help with the economics, right? We can help the church with the economics. If they're having a little trouble with the economics, we can sort of explain it. Right? The Chevy Volt is an amazing engineering accomplishment. It just costs too much. Let's not even talk about whether it's actually environmentally good, right? I mean, you're fueling it up from a coal-fired power plant. It's not clear that environmentally it's a great thing. They forgot the law of supply and demand, right? When it's really expensive, and these are expensive even with each of us kicking in $8,000 on the credit, each of us kicking in for the development of it, the law of supply and demand, it turns out the demand's just not there. And you have to take that into account. We must take economic laws into account, or we're being bad stewards. Another example of this is the biofuel mandate. So this is actual biofuel consumption. The green part down here is corn-based ethanol. This stuff up here in other colors are forms of ethanol that do not exist yet. Yet companies that sell fuel are required to use them. Indeed, so if you saw this in the paper this year, for the first mandate kicked in this year, the fuels don't exist, so they couldn't be sold, so the companies were fined. Right? So oil companies are being fined for not selling non-existent fuel. I'm a lawyer, so that makes sense to me, but for you, yeah, that's crazy, right? That's just crazy. Now, there is an answer to this, right? So economics is a dismal science. I'm certainly a dismal person. That's what my children say when I tell them they can't have something. But there is an answer. So let me just give you two positive stories, and then we'll open it up for questions. So positive story number one. Refrigerators. Now, that's kind of a weird choice. But let me just tell you, I love refrigerators. I'm a huge fan of refrigerators. I grew up, I was a kid in the 60s. I remember my mom defrosting the refrigerator, right? So we had to take everything out, put it in an ice chest, let the ice melt. You were tempted to get a knife and pry it off. If you did that, you were in danger of puncturing the sides. All sorts of bad things happened. It was messy. Nobody liked doing it. You waited until the frost was really thick. Nobody does that anymore, right? The reason we don't do that anymore is our refrigerators are self-defrosting. The children in the back are looking, oh God, here, you know. When I was young, we walked uphill to school both ways. So how does a refrigerator defrost? You ever think of that? It heats up the walls. It melts the frost. So your freezer heats up, and then it cools down again. That uses energy, right? It's convenient. It's great. It's a fabulous thing. My mother was so excited when she finally got a frost-free refrigerator, right? And so that kind of technology, so energy use, that's this line, has been going up for refrigerators from after World War II to 1972. And those of you who were around then will remember why that happened. I'll come to that in a minute. So energy is getting more. Why is it getting more? Well, the size is getting larger, right? From World War II on, the size of refrigerators has been getting larger, so they take more energy. And they get features like becoming frost-free and making ice, right? We had to make ice in trays. Nobody does that anymore. Now it's the ice maker, cold water comes out of it, hot water comes out of it, all sorts of stuff, right? The ice is crushed up for you, all sorts of things, right? All which take energy. We've added all these features that take energy, and things that were unimaginable in the 70s are commonplace, right? So now today I have a refrigerator that makes ice and delivers cold water and crushes the ice and stuff like that. That wasn't, only maybe like Elvis Presley might have had that. And probably had a guy who crushed the ice and dumped it through a thing. Nobody had this stuff then, right? So they've gotten better. So they got bigger, and they're still getting bigger, and they were using more energy to do all this, and then suddenly they started using less energy. And the reason they started using less energy is energy got more expensive. We had the Arab oil embargo, price of energy went up, and people said, I love the big refrigerator, I like the ice maker and stuff, but I also want it to cost less to operate. And people who make refrigerators saw, I can sell more if I cut that. Here's the price. The price is going down. So the price of these things is falling. They're getting bigger, they have more features, and they're becoming more efficient, right? And that happened without any government mandates. This point is before any government rules about refrigerators, right? And the slope of the line doesn't change. So for an economist, that says whatever the government did in here didn't have an impact, right? It's going down at pretty much the same rate. You can label stuff. There's actually wonderful stuff by a guy named Indor Gokhlani showing that air pollution, this sort of line exists for all kinds of air pollution, and this point is always before the national government did anything. It's basically when you point out to people there's a problem, they do something about it. Turns out, and the government comes in later and takes credit. So that's a really great story, right? The marketplace delivered more efficient things that are better in every dimension, right? Every refrigerator today is better than a refrigerator in 1970. So we should embrace change. This is an early cell phone. Right, this is even pre-Gordon Gekko, right? Gordon Gekko had the brick. This thing is a brick with its attached brick, so you had two bricks. This was an early IBM PC, right? I lusted after that computer. My first computer was a K-Pro 2. Anybody have a K-Pro 2? All right. 191K drives. It was a metal suitcase that weighed 40 pounds. It was portable. I sort of walked like this for years from hauling it around. It was very exciting. And one of my professors in graduate school had this. And that was a tremendous thing. I really wanted that, but all I could afford was a K-Pro 2, which cost $2,000. Right? I had to work hard to get that K-Pro 2 with a 300 baud modem. So my phone does everything those things did and more, right? And this is much better and it cost me $200, right? And $200 today instead of $2,000 in 1990. I mean, it's like $1,000 in 1990, right? So this is tremendous progress, right? This applies to energy as well. And so the last, we have not fixed microphones so speakers can't wreck them. The last thing I want to tell you about is about improving gasoline. All right? So this is a Spitfire from World War II, and that's an oil refinery from World War II. And this is an amazing story that I think is definitely undertold. You have to really dig into World War II history books and oil industry history books, which are kind of a weird thing to read together to find this story out. So gasoline was originally a waste product, right? So John D. Rockefeller monopolized oil refineries to make kerosene, which was the number one product that was being made out of oil, which was used for lighting in homes and fuel for stoves and things like that. And kerosene is a very light component of oil. So when you take a barrel of oil, right, you sort of divide it up into fractions, and there's the heavy hydrocarbons that you have to break up, and there's the light ones, which are easy to burn. So kerosene's a very light one, and that's what he was making. And gasoline, people threw it away. And so you actually go back and look at pictures of early refineries, and they just dumped the gasoline into a stream. So it was a pollutant, and they threw it away. Rockefeller actually bought a company that made gasoline stoves to try to create a market for this. Now, gasoline is kind of explosive, and so it's not a good cooking fuel. That investment did not pan out, right? Fortunately, Henry Ford comes along and gets the automobile industry going, and there's demand for gasoline. So by 1910, we were actually short of gasoline. So in 1910, you would hear the same thing you hear today, which is we're running out of gasoline. We're running out, we don't have enough. We were the largest oil producer in the world at that point. We're running out of gasoline. What are we going to do? Well, some people said, well, if we could get more gasoline out of a barrel of oil, that would be good. And so they applied some technology to it, and lo and behold, they got a little more out of it. And then there was also a quality issue. So gasoline varied highly between relatively low octane and higher octane. Higher octane is more energy content. Your engine doesn't knock. This is probably a theoretical problem to anyone under the age of 50. But it used to be that engines would sort of make this noise, and it was seen as a bad thing, and they were being less efficient. So we had something called the octane wars in the 1920s and early 1930s. Companies were competing to deliver higher quality gasoline. And they did. Standard Oil's, in fact, named Standard Oil because the notion was that their products were the same everywhere you went, which was a radical idea, right? This is the McDonald's of gasoline and kerosene, and because quality varied so highly. All right, so we get this octane war going. So in the mid-30s, a new technology is invented called catalytic cracking, which can be seen there. So you take a catalyst and put it in with the oil, and you apply pressure and energy to it in the form of heat, and the molecules break apart. Right? So you take the big heavy molecules and break them into smaller ones. And if you apply enough energy to oil, you can break up the molecules and recombine them as you see fit. And this made more of the nice light fractions, gasoline, out of the barrel of oil. So you're getting more gasoline per barrel. This was introduced in 1936. At that time, at the beginning of the 1930s, 100-octane fuel was a reference chemical that you used to calibrate your equipment. Right? And it cost $25 a gallon. So you certainly weren't putting it in your car. It's $25 in 1931, right? So there's hundreds and hundreds of dollars today. And in the mid-30s, the Army Air Corps was looking ahead, and everybody could sort of see that war was coming, and they knew that airplanes were going to play a role, and they so wanted to get some designs going for aircraft for the Army Air Corps. And so they went to the oil companies and they said, what's the best fuel you can make at a reasonable price? Because that's going to affect the kind of engines we design. It's going to affect how much equipment we can put on the plane. If you have a more powerful engine, you can get more guns, more bombs, and so forth on the plane. And in particular, Royal Dutch Shell and Standard Oil of New Jersey, which were pioneers in this catalytic cracking, said, well, we've got this new technology, and we think it'll work pretty well. You tell us how much you want to buy. You guarantee you'll buy it. We'll make the stuff. And they said, well, we really like 100-octane aviation fuel. And we don't want to pay very much for it. So I said, okay, how about 25 cents a gallon? I said, yes, we commit to buying a very large amount of this. I said, you got a deal. So from its commercial introduction in 1936, the first catalytic cracker went online in 1936. 1940, they were producing 122,000 barrels a day of 100-octane fuel. By 1944, we were producing 1 million. Right? And the reason I put a Spitfire up there was getting the 100-octane fuel to Britain during those sort of really dark days after France fell, and as the Battle of Britain is being fought. German pilots actually wrote that they thought they were fighting new planes because the British planes in performance improved so much from the better fuel. So they were able to climb faster, they were able to carry heavier weaponry. And when you read the sort of oil company World War II literature, now, of course, they got an incentive to portray it this way, but so, in a sense, the oil industry helped win the Battle of Britain, right? They wouldn't have been able to outfight the Luftwaffe if they hadn't had this fuel. That made the superior performance better. Now, you needed really good pilots, you needed the bravery and all that kind of stuff, but that innovation, which happened totally in the private sector, saved the world from the evils of Nazism. And that is, I think, an example of what we get, the innovation we get when we leave the energy industry alone, or we give them performance targets and ask them to meet it, but don't try to dictate the choice of technology. And unfortunately, largely what this administration's policy, and actually going back, long back, administration policies have been, the history of US energy policy is to make it be about helping special interests. It's not about helping, setting targets, it's not about getting improvements, it's not about leaving the market alone, it's about dictating a particular technology, a particular firm, a particular resource is going to receive not just our money, but our children's money. And I don't think that's a particularly Christian thing to do. I don't think it's Christian to borrow from the future and saddle them with debt to develop, even if we were trying to develop good stuff, right? I mean, even if we were trying to do the right thing, it wouldn't be appropriate to ask our children to pay for it. It's certainly not appropriate to ask them to pay for paying off the president's friends, which is largely what energy policy has been under both Republicans and Democrats for a long time. So I think it's time that we have an energy policy that focuses on reality, that focuses on helping set clear goals that are going to improve our lives, and that does so without burdening our children. Thank you.